Good evening, everybody, and thank you for coming. You're so welcome to this year's edition of Friends Forum of the Friends of St. Mary's.
Well, thank you very much. I hope it's okay I do it without a microphone. It's hopefully clear enough. So, well, thank you for having me. It's great to be able to walk over from home and to just talk to people about what I'm passionate about and not having to travel very far. But I always love talking about Ethiopia. My very first job after my PhD was teaching in Addis Ababa University. So that's about 30 years ago. The country came out of conflict then. Actually, the story was relatively hopeful in the entire period until about a year ago, where conflict again took off and, well, we have to be honest, intensified. There was always bits of conflict everywhere in Ethiopia. And of course, now we get back in the news where a lot of people are at risk of famine, of starvation. And what I want to do is briefly giving a bit of a glimpse of, the story of development and conflict in recent times, and especially, to give a little bit of a sense of, what is it that the conflict is really about, and what are the grievances that people have, how political leaders tend to exploit this, and how we get in the sorry state we are now in the country. So I'm going to try to talk for maybe 20-25 minutes, and hopefully there's a lot of time then are still left before the snacks arrive, because apparently I will be between the snacks and yeah. So anyway, talking about Ethiopia, where it's located, of course you all know it's like, bordering to the west is Sudan, the south is Kenya, to the east is Somalia, and it has this particular location in the Horn of Africa. And it's, what's that kind of country? It's actually now the second largest country in Africa, 150 million people, so the second after Nigeria. In terms of poverty, these days the way we think about it often is to try to express it. What would people be able to afford in goods and spending power here? So we especially what we call purchasing parity. It's like the equivalent as if someone has, on average per year, about £1,800 and going to the village shop and spending £1,800 over the whole year. So of course that's still very poor, but actually it's probably 3 times as well off than when I first went there in 1991. It's a country now, Abiy Ahmed is the prime minister, I'll say a bit more about him further, but it's a country always been proud that it never was colonized. Okay, it was for 6 years. The Italians tried in 35 to 41 and didn't quite succeed. It never really pacified people in that period. It's also interesting religious term, 2/3 of them are Christians. When I first reached there, they make a point always telling me we were Christians before you, and that's true. Christians came from Yemen into Ethiopia very early on, maybe even the 2nd century, and it's about 2/3 Christian, Orthodox Christian. Actually, it's a rising share. About 10% of the Christians are now evangelicals, maybe a bit more, and the rest is Muslim. And that's not divided by ethnicity, but it's more north-south. So the eastern part is Muslim, the western part is Christian. And there you have really a lot of different nationalities there. And that actually is important for the story, but actually this is not homogeneous in nationality. I don't like to call it ethnicity because they're not that different. There's no obvious ethnic difference really amongst a lot of the people. But 34% would identify themselves as Oromo, 27% as Amhara, 6% as Somali, 6% then also as Tigrayan. And let me see. And this is actually where the ethnicities are, okay? And it's actually also quite important. If you look at that map, the entire conflict, what we're talking about, is about a very small bit of land there in the north, Tigray. So this is not as if the whole country is at war. It's actually not at all. The Amhara, as there are about 27%, are border there up to the north. Afar, Somali, they're very small groups because they have very low population density. They are kind of deserts. The fertile land is to the west. the kind of Christian areas historically there to the west. So then you have these places, and then Oromia is the largest part of the largest state as well within it, and they also have the largest population. Now this map, you know, we said the rest smaller groups, anyone who's quickly adding up, I only get to about less than 80%. There's lots of dozens of others, very tiny groups, mainly in the west or in the southwest of the country. Now that's kind of important. It's not homogeneous, and its history tends to reflect that. Now, you wouldn't think so. This is the view if whenever I land in Addis Ababa airport, that's what you see. And it's this kind of really beautiful country with mountain areas and very fertile land. This is, as capitals go, are kind of delightful. But actually behind it is now a huge amount of division. And so the recent events that you will have heard about, it actually happened now a year ago. There was an attack in Mekelle, that's the capital of that northern bit of Tigray, by the Tplf. They are the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front. It sounds like a name from the 70s, and it is a name from the 70s. It's the time, I was a Marxist organization originally that was going to fight in the bush and so on. But they attacked in Mekelle, the capital of Tigray, Ethiopian army base. Now, who is the Tplf? Actually, they were running the country for about 28 years since 1991. So there were maybe a particular group, but they had been running, and I'll say a bit more about it. With the help of Eritrea, I can ask later on in questions a bit more on Eritrea and all. It's all very complicated. Initially, they were pushed out. Then basically, the government took back to try and push out. It goes up and down. But what we hear about is this humanitarian crisis. And the humanitarian crisis has a lot to do with, well, is it an effective blockade or a de facto blockade, or some people say it's a strategy to block. I'm actually much more on the fence about it. I know leaders on both sides. And my former research assistant became later on the vice president of the Tplf. He's now in jail. I tend to know the prime minister and minister of finance on the other side. They all used to be friends together. So, you know, I know them. I don't think there's really that strategy of really using handicraft as a weapon. But meanwhile, the conflict is causing a lot of suffering, and aid flows are not getting through. So basically, now, this northern bit of the country, about 5 million people, that's essentially not much is coming through. A lot of people would need some support. It may not actually be food, even though the press likes to present. It's actually health services are dramatically disrupted. And usually in humanitarian crisis, it's health that actually causes people to die in the end. But it's actually about 9.5 million or 9.2 million people in need of support. If you think the population of 110 or 150 million, so it's almost 10% now, would need support. And it's because of this yo-yo effect of the war pushing in, crossing south, going up, actually quite a lot of people are affected. The thing we worry about most is about 400,000 people in Tigray. We worry that they're at risk of famine. What does that mean? We actually mean that literally they are at risk of becoming so vulnerable, probably to disease, from lack of nutrition, that they actually may well die. They're risking to do that. It's not, I still am hopeful that we're not getting there. So, and meanwhile, as the press reports, we're getting all the stories about human rights abuses, not least actually by the Eritrean army. It's another complicated story. They got involved in a conflict, as it often happens. But what I want to do is briefly giving you 5 key characters in the recent history that actually tell us an awful lot of why we got to where we are. Okay? And so the 5 characters, we go back to the 19th century first. This one doesn't look like an emperor, but he was the emperor of Ethiopia, Menelik II. Okay, so he ruled the country from 1886 to 1930. He was the emperor. He was actually one of the third or the second, depending on how you want to count, emperor of Ethiopia. He came himself from somewhere in these Amhara areas. Remember on the map I was showing you, that's like the northwest, but just under this Tigray where the conflict is. This is a bit where the Tigrayan nationalistic grievance, or put it slightly differently, where the politicians that want to excite people find their story. Because basically, grabbed power in the north of the country by defeating a Tigrayan king. And so he unified the northern parts of the country at first, somewhere in 1886. Okay, unification with violence. It gets more complicated because I say Ethiopia wasn't a colonial state. Actually, it is a colonial state itself. It actually, then that army, over that period in the 1880s and 90s, went south and started gradually to take over what is now present-day Ethiopia. Literally, they would send northerners, both from Tigray and from Amhara, to colonize. Farmers would settle in the south and push some of these other groups out. It's from that time that the second big grievance, which is the Oromo saying we're ruled by northern people, comes from. So you get three groups that actually don't really like each other. Amharas that feel like they're the natural leaders of the country. Tigrayans feel like they should have been it. And then the Oromo that feel like the occupied people. And actually, when people say, and Ethiopians will tell you, oh, we've never been colonized. No, actually, Ethiopia is a colonial state. It's probably one of the last colonial states in Africa, and partly helps to explain the nature of the conflict as well. So it's effectively a colonizer of the south. Of course, Menelik is mainly famous in Ethiopia because he kicked the Italians out. The Italians tried to come in 1896. From Eritrea, they tried to come in. Look, there are not many colonial armies that were defeated in Africa. In fact, he was very much the one that did it. And it's still revered as a battle, of course. It was the basis on which Mussolini decided he had to come back in, and that was the narrative why Ethiopia had to be conquered in 1935, because they had defeated us in the past. Anyway, but that's one character. A second one is probably the one you know best, Haile Selassie. Okay, he was emperor in power, and he more or less, not totally peacefully, but he managed to get power and became emperor in 1930 until 1974. In fact, there is one thing very striking in Ethiopia. There is actually rarely, if ever in history, been a transition of power that has been peaceful. In fact, Christopher Platon, who is this great historian writing about the Horn of Africa, he would say it's only happened twice since the 18th century. Literally twice that the transition of power is being handled peacefully and not led to civil conflict. And in fact, that's another thing to recognize, is that maybe, Haile Selassie also grabbed power and pushed someone aside who was probably a better pretender. It actually is maybe at the moment of conflict is partly to do with peaceful transitions in Ethiopia. So that's another part complicated. Of course, Haile Selassie lived through the Italian occupation, went to Bath during the war. In the post-war period, he then decided to take inside his own country, Eritrea, that had actually been an independent colony of Italy, put it partly in, creating a lot of grief there and conflict further up north, but that's done again further stories. But he lost power by the military, no peaceful transitions of power, in 1974, and he stayed there until this guy took over. Mengistu Haile Mariam, military leader, came there then in that period. I don't want to say too much about it, except for he was probably the most awful of all the leaders they've ever had. Large-scale killings all the way, stories of some of the people that I was working with in the university. Actually, as youngsters, at 15, 16-year-olds, they would randomly be picked up and thrown in jail. And then to make an example, because they may have spoken out, some would be executed. Literally, death squads would go around the streets of Addis Ababa, going into classroom, taking teachers out, taking pupils out, summarily executing them in the late 1970s. Violence everywhere. A very violent time. And actually, it's mainly mentioned because also another grievance from Tigray to Addis Ababa. This is the time of Live Aid. And this is the time of all the things, the famine of 84, 85.
was basically, this guy definitely used hunger as a weapon. He made sure that no food could come through and tried to starve Tigray during this period as one way of defeating, which was already then the Tplf, the same Tplf that is now in fight. That's the period that they got their very strong vibe, never trust Addis Ababa, will always should fight. And so you have an incredibly nationalistic feeling inside that terrain and saying, never trust anyone further south than from where we are going to actually really push. And it's that period that got that deep consciousness definitely in the armed struggle in it. Probably somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people died during that famine. In fact, I did some research at some point on longer term consequences. Unfortunately, even though we're all very involved, and in fact I started in development already because of that whole period, it got through, but far too late, very little impact. Just 500,000 to 1 million people died as well. Anyway, he was kicked out by that same Tplf that is now still on the thing. Meles Zenawi became prime minister. Okay, any organization that has People's Liberation Front or somewhere in it, you can imagine it's not necessarily a very peaceful organization internally. It took a lot of killings internally, getting rid of probably, and there was a calculation that in the mid-1980s, probably something like 75 different guerrilla groups were fighting the army. But of course, sometimes to get the upper hand, you first have to defeat the other guerrilla groups before you can do it. So they came there in power. They had formed a coalition, but there were a lot of people that already by the time in 91 they overthrew the government that they started hating themselves. But anyway, Meles Zenawi was a remarkable character. Okay, so he became a close friend of Tony Blair's. But actually, a lot of people, Joseph Stiglitz, who is a Nobel Prize winner in economics, he became a very close friend. He's still around. Nick Stern, the man from the Stern Report and so on climate, I remember him once in a lift. He stopped me and said, Meles, he's my best friend in the world. And the kind of thing. This guy had actually quite a lot of charisma. In fact, Joe Stiglitz said that he thought Meles was the smartest person he ever met. I had a few conversations with him. This guy was quite amazing. He was ruthless as well, and that's another part of the story. So he himself was a medical student in Addis Ababa during this very bloody period after the initial military takeover and execution later on of Haile Selassie. He was a medical doctor, went into the bush. A movement, the way you get these stories, 12 people started it, and in the end they took power of Addis Ababa. Full of romantic thing. He was a very skillful military leader who overthrew then Haile Selassie in 91, who formed a coalition, but he was never going to give power away from the Tplf, the military side of the Tplf. So he basically kept control. Now, for me, this is actually quite a tricky one, because all of us actually in that period, there was something like, knowing the history of Ethiopia, that you couldn't have some admiration of what he tried to do. In fact, what he did, and these days a lot of revisionism is happening, it's very easy. But at the time, at last we had an Ethiopian leader who wanted to develop his country. And this is not by crazy massive projects. The period, especially between 2000 and 2015, was amazing in the country. They reduced poverty dramatically, improved health outcomes, education outcomes dramatically. In fact, by 2019, the IMF declared it the fastest growing economy of the last decade in the world. This was actually quite an amazing time. And yeah, I was quite involved often talking to the economic advisors, and we were often working together. Also, when I worked at Tplf as a chief economist, we were working and providing a lot of aid as the UK, because we knew somehow, and maybe we were naive and said, look, in due course, several of the people there were quite liberal-minded, they would open up. They would open up and the political space would open. And at the same time, people's living standards really were improving. Poverty was reducing. And, the aid that the government gave, it was not based on political views or whatever. It was actually pretty good. And so there's lots of work on that is doing it. But political space remained closed. So it led to a huge amount of aid. Ethiopia became the international darling. In fact, the US under Obama massive amounts of aid was donated. And in the end, this was a coalition led by the Tplf, by the Tigrayans, by 6% of the population. All the leading interlocutors I knew, most of them were Tigrayan. Top functions were. They were very, very good technocrats. One of them is well known. He's now the Director General of the World Health Organization. He was the health minister, member of the Tplf, who is like leading the whole COVID response. So they were quite remarkable people and very committed, but came from a very narrow group. Now, what happened next? Well, Melis died young. He died in Brussels, pretty surprising. He had cancer, and he was only in his 50s and left a bit of a vacuum. But where we got to is, things that we have, a northern control of one part of the population, and typically identified with Hamaras, but then a repression also of the great claims in the north, so kind of deep-rooted historical grievances, easily exploited. And then another grievance, to everybody to see Tigrayans really in charge of controlling military and the state, I would still say, doing actually remarkably good things in development and progress for ordinary people, but in a very controlled way. And I wouldn't want to say it's authoritarian in an extreme form, but it's a bit like, we think these days of, say, South Korea as this development wonder. Well, it did actually something quite similar. There was a military dictatorship during the key periods of economic developments of Korea as well. What happened? Well, the one disenfranchised group that definitely had nothing to say was the Oromos. They were, again, historically, all the time controlled by the North. The Tigrayans were really occupying essentially Addis Ababa and seemed to be doing this. Addis Ababa is in the center of Oromia, of the region of Oromo. Much violence. Much more to be said about it. But basically, in this period, we would go there, the students would go on the street, there would be violence, there would be killings. It would not be Myanmar-style repression of opposition, but there would always be victims and innocent students being killed and people arrested and all kinds of stuff. And this violence kept on going on in 2019. Melis was then dead for 7 years. Actually, the coalition started falling apart. The coalition that had some Oromo leaders in it as well and Amhara leaders fell apart. And that basically led to the rise of power inside the coalition of the final figure that I want to talk about, the current prime minister. So one of the sad things about this all, and people in the press doesn't really articulate that, these were people that were actually working together. These are not an opposition leader coming to power. He was the head of internal security under Melis. But he came from the Oromo area. He was the deputy leader of one of the coalition partners of the Tplf, but had, quote unquote, quite happily always been part for 10, 15 years of running the country. But he represented the Oromo side, and actually within the coalition that was in power, he was elected as prime minister, and the Tplf actually had tried to block it. They voted against it. They were outmaneuvered by the other partners. The country was already ablaze, especially Addis Ababa and surrounding areas of the place. It came happening. So he came to power as an Oromo and as a bit more as a nationalistic leader for all Ethiopia, definitely not Tigray. But as I said, he was a security minister before. And then Abiy Ahmed does then what he does best. He is great at incredible big gesture politics to taking this. He released all political prisoners. I remember sitting next to the Prime Minister's economic advisor in Oxford, who we had invited for a time. And I'll be very honest, both of us were shocked when we saw it on our phones. And I know that I said, wow, I'm not sure I would have done this. Because there were some really awful characters there as well. Some I have known who had really blood on their hands, were very selfish, just doing it all for their own stuff. But yeah, there were quote-unquote opposition. They were all released, almost in one go. He flies out to Eritrea, which had become by then, to all intents and purposes for the whole world, a real terrible state, a rogue state that you couldn't be trusted for anything. He makes peace with Isaias Afewerki. The Tigrayans are furious because for them that's arch enemy number one. So he, as a colleague of mine, a political scientist, says Abiy is great at starting fights, but he has no clue of ever putting them out. So he basically did all these things. Look, and I can't help it. I was rather pleased that he got the Nobel and thought that's actually quite cool, the Ethiopian thing. God knows what will happen next. None of us really foresaw what was happening next, because also these TPLF leaders, even though they didn't like him, he was actually working reasonably well with them together. It wasn't falling apart. They had, some of the leaders had gone back to Mekelle, to the capital of Tigray, but the others had stuck together and stayed together. Meanwhile, Abiy actually started the campaign, set up a new party, and got themselves actually last year, actually quite a lot of legitimacy. International organizations will say, oh, there's not a legitimate election. If you just try to gauge public opinion through a combination of social media, which is totally free there already for quite some time, and so on, he has actually a lot of support. It doesn't have to be organized. He's not a dictator in a simple sense that has to be lived. People actually really like him because he stood up against Tigray. And so it's a really kind of problematic thing there as well. And of course, gradually, he tried to push out the Tigray leadership and should set out of the military. And that's where it now all goes wrong. And so we come to the final position now. Over the last 10 years, and probably especially over the last 3-4 years, we got an incredible heating up of the entire political conversation. Okay? It's not for nothing when this whistleblower from the US, from Facebook, gave evidence. She mentioned Ethiopia as one of the places why actually Facebook can be so dangerous. Because we knew that all along. There's no control on anything that was being said. And there's an incredible level of hate speech that has been going on ever since basically Facebook got into Ethiopia. And so we're getting an increased use of a political mobilization of the idea of nationality by all the political leaders. Where it used to be quite subdued and the leadership, Meles and others, were careful with that, now that became the game in town. Some of these opposition leaders that were released, okay, some are back in jail now, were in the extreme form of it. Some are called Jawar Mohammed. To be honest, this was the one I said, I'm not sure I want him in the country. Can't we send him back to the US? Because he is so awful in his hate speech that you don't know what to actually do with it. And each leadership, the TPLF, the Tigrayans, are very strongly supported. They really have their population, even though it's a small population behind them, while meanwhile Abiy has a lot of support. The international community, even though I was Dr. Grant's advisor on this, and he tried to this occasion, we went out to Ethiopia in January 2021, tried to talk to Abiy and so on. But, look, as maybe today's events in Parliament show that Mr. Raab wasn't necessarily the most skillful operator or indeed person with a long-term vision. He didn't quite see what it would take to get the international community dealing with it. I think the US terribly mishandled it. There are several people in the US administration, although I'm generally sympathetic to them. Actually, it includes the person in charge of all the COVID action, was in fact married to a TPLF leader in the 1980s during the battle when they tried to get power. He died, and at some point she was called back to the US, immediately became a director in the State Department, or in short, she was CIA. She's now a very powerful person in the administration. The leader of USAID was very close to TPLF. Obama administration, probably the UK as well, we were close to TPLF in some sense supporting the development. We've tried to keep as the UK a little bit more better. The US from the beginning said, Abiy, you're to blame for everything. And it doesn't help. I know Ethiopia well enough. It doesn't come in to simply say, you are wrong, you're right. It's far more complex. And they have such a proud sense of independence that, outsiders start lecturing, it makes it stronger. Where we reach with the crisis now is a real internationalization of the crisis. There are different states wondering whether they should start supporting TPLF or the government. At the moment, TPLF doesn't have much. There are concerns with China, there are concerns with some Gulf states siding and internationalization. My hope is, which I also Foreign Office have advised us to say, look, the best scenario is stalemate. These people are, they are strongly supported, they have extremely strong views. We want some stalemate in the conflict because as long as it looks as if one of them can win, there's not enough room for negotiations. In the end, both the leadership of Tplf and Abiy will have to go, but it has to be part of a process of national dialogue and getting it. We know behind the scenes that things happening, but it's actually, we're not there. And both parties still believe they can win the conflict. If you have a conflict where both parties believe they can win, it will last for much longer. And that's my fear, is I think continue war. And what is the biggest sad thing, probably also for many of us working on, but definitely for the country, this is a country that has come so far. As I said, 3 times as well off as it used to be. So many people lifted out of poverty, had some of the fastest poverty reductions that we observe in the world. As I said, fastest growing economy. Yes, it was not perfect, but there was something there that was progressing. Meanwhile, we may get more and more images of humanitarian crisis, of planes that have to drop food and other kinds of stuff which we thought it was behind. Thank you. I'll stop now. Thank you.